OG Rose, and today we're going to be talking about Real Speculations by Cadell last. We've already spoken of the introduction, and now we're going to be talking about thought foundations, global mind, and again, you can pick up Real Speculations on Amazon. I highly suggest it. Cadell is going to be starting this section with ordinary consciousness to absolute knowing, and to really kind of help us think about what we see going on in Hegel. Cadell taught a very important class on the phenomenology of spirit, also the science of logic. These classes can be found on philosophyportal.org. And there's something, I love this quote from Zizek on this idea that Hegel is this big alien of modern philosophy. Literally, it's almost a doxa of contemporary philosophy, 19th century onwards, to define yourself through a distance to Hegel. And there's this kind of, Zizek has also spoken of Hegel as this radical density of thought that has to be wrestled with. And you could say today, because we have not really wrestled with Hegel, we're having to go back to Hegel. And I think it's we're trying to get better foundations for thinking, the logic of global brain, as the anthology is titled, to think of our moment. And there's something in Hegel that we missed, that we overlooked, that we were perhaps too quick to define ourselves against, and as a result, we're lacking a foundation that we need. So, from the book, page 42, so what exactly is Hegel saying in the Phenomenology of Spirit, this totally confused work, and why should you care? This is Cadell's writing, and that's an allusion to what Zizek points out, that when the Phenomenology of Spirit came out, when it was first published, people saw it as very jumbled and confused. Cadell points out three basics can be covered in 3 points. These basics can be covered in 3 points. First, spirit naturally develops self in basic stages, unfolding in shapes that we can call consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, spirit, and religion. Second, these basic stages are structured by contingent logics of form. However, within their contingent unfolding, there is an inner necessity pointing towards a science of knowing spirit, or spiritual knowing. So there's a certain instability in each of these that kind of drives them. Third, the necessary science of spirit is a state of absolute knowing which involves a certain immanent relation between thought and being. While this state was achieved by spirit in pre-modern times by philosophical consciousness from Parmenides on, it is only now becoming fully reflexive and aware of itself in historic context. So the logic of Hegel is kind of a realization more than a making of something totally new. Really, there's a danger in Hegel of trying to imagine the future instead of tearing with the past. The past history is sort of the structure that we need to orbit, that we need to take seriously, and we have to focus on our moment, not trying to get out of it, because we could say that in the now, I'll talk about the state of now versus the state of nature in a paper on philosophy, elements of philosophy of right, called Hegel's Justification of Hegel. There's a way in which Hegel really wants to emphasize that the now contains in itself that which can propel spirit in its unfolding. And we actually miss that if we try to tarry with the future, or if we try to nostalgically return to the past. And I like how Cadell writes out how we can think of the stages in the phenomenological journey, as Cadell has called it in Phenomenology of Spirit. He talks about, so to start, consciousness explores its capacity for sense, perception, understanding, positive, but consciousness lacks a self-reflexivity of its own understanding, negative. Consciousness is lacking self-consciousness. So there's a limit here that consciousness comes up against. And this limit, also there's a critical idea in Hegel that once you know of a limit, you've kind of surpassed it, right? Like once you become aware of a limit, there's already a movement beyond it. So once consciousness is aware that it lacks self-consciousness, hey, that's a self-conscious move, right? So there's this interesting idea that in reflexivity, awareness of a limit entails going beyond the limit. So second, self-consciousness struggles with its mirror image internally and externally, positive, but self-consciousness lacks rational understanding of nature and society, i.e. self-consciousness lacks reason. So it lacks something external to it. And for me, this is a key kind of movement from self-consciousness to reason. It's because when I identifies with other, when we can make the absolute choice of becoming other. But that was in a presentation I gave. Anyway, Third, reason formulates laws, principles, tendencies of natural thought, positive, but reason lacks embodied grounding in pragmatic insight, communal duty, negative. Reason lacks spirit. 4, spirit uses pragmatism for self-insight into duty, reality beyond consensus, positive. Spirit lacks connection to a concrete universal idea, negative. Spirit lacks religion. Religion connects to, and then 5th, religion connects to universal beyond individuality to communal embodiment, positive. Religion lacks understanding that universal idea is a contradiction to singularity, negative. Religion lacks absolute knowing. All right, but what about absolute knowing? This is Cadell writing. With the level of absolute knowledge, we gain a special inversion of the logic that characterizes the phenomenal drama. Absolute knowing is a universal idea as self-contradiction with the other, positive. Absolute knowledge can engage phenomenal drama as if from without, negative. Absolute knowing is the positivity of negativity, lacking being itself. So here, absolute knowing, also we can think of absolute knowing as the absolute limit of knowing. It's not like omni-knowing or something, where omniscience, where you know everything. It's where you actually come to know that limitation is necessary for the very possibility of knowing, and you accept that. You resolve yourself to that. Dylan Shaw and Dimitri had a great talk about this, kind of resolving yourself. You're resolute to the historic process. So you accept that there's a certain lack in knowing. There's a certain limit to knowing. And you actually see that as positive, because without that limitation, you couldn't know anything at all, and there couldn't be further unfolding. So you come to accept. But there's a certain humility in that acceptance. And that's very important. And then in that very limitation, what's very interesting is the absolute knowing of that absolute limitation actually is a creative process, because it changed the subject in history, so it changes the way that history can unfold. But we are limited from knowing how exactly. So there's this interesting sort of creativity here, but it's also an open creativity, because you can't predict ahead of time how it's going to be. And so, Cadell writes, consequently, what the phenomenology ultimately prepares scientific spirit for is the logic of its own free self-determination in truth. In order for spirit to reach this capacity in knowing, it has to purge itself of the shapes that constitute the truth of its early development. So you have to keep hitting limits and ultimately come to a place where I and other system and subject, to use language from Cadell, are brought together. And this is at the foundation of thought. Like what is being described here has to be at the foundation of our thinking, or our thinking will be misguided. So to put it another way, we have to think of ourselves as tearing with negativity. So these are foundational. These are foundations. These are premises that must be located at the foundation of all thought, or the thought will probably be misguided or lead to unintentional consequences that are ironic and auto-cannibalistic, as I might like to put it. So first, we have to identify with becoming other, becoming alien. I has to identify with otherness. That's first. Second, we have to tarry with the now, with what is given. We have to assume what is given, what is now, and tarry with it, as opposed to try to erase it or replace it with something that we think is better. 3, we have to make primary in our thinking history as an unfolding process. And 4, we have to accept a necessity of encountering limitation that must surprise us, because if it doesn't surprise us, then it's not really a limit. We already knew about it. So obviously this suggests dialectics is at the foundation of thinking, and that dialectics can lead to a speculative reason, which is elaborated on in the science of logic, but that speculative reason must emerge out of these foundations that Cadell is putting forth. So it's a tremendous paper. And then the second chapter of this section of Real Speculations is called Phenomenology of Spirit is Not a Theory of Everything. And I think this is very important. A lot of people think Hegel is giving us a kind of theory of everything, how everything works. Really, Hegel is giving us a historic account, a historic development of spirit according to encounters with limitation. But it's not really a theory of everything, in the sense of once we know this theory, we can predict the future. And I think this is kind of critical. We can't predict the future based on Hegel's thinking. And I think theories of everything are strongly tied to a dream of being able to predict things. to have a certain predictive power that would prove the theory. And Hegel's not giving us that. Hegel is, yes, there is something about Hegel that is bringing a lot of things together, but a theory of everything, I think, would not really describe what Hegel is doing. And Cadell does a very good job of explaining that. He'll also talk about, kind of alluding, thinking, well, is Hegel something like an integral framework? For Wilber, page 61, the goal is to integrate all of these perspectives into a dynamic conversion with each other, say Sigmund Freud, Skinner, Gadamer, Marx. And, we could say that a lot of the theories of everything are a sort of integration. And you read Hegel and it kind of like, oh, he's integrating everything together. But I think, again, what Cadell writes here on page 63 is right at it. Hegel's aim and result in the phenomenology is to explicate for the reader a coming to be of knowing itself, and also to explicate for the reader what the standpoint of knowing means to philosophy. This dramatically changes the status that many theorists would give to either mathematical propositions or logical propositions about being. Instead, Hegel privileges the location and the becoming of the knowing subject that is both for itself and in itself. So, what we see in Hegel, again, is not this kind of grand theory synthesizing everything, but a development. It is a historic, it is a history of a development that we have seen, that if we have seen thus far, say, as outlined in the phenomenology of spirit, which again, it's also not developmental in the sense of you go from consciousness to self-consciousness and then self-consciousness to reason. Well, all the stages are always already at once. We've already kind of gone through them. We're at this moment in history. Now, you could say that every new paradigm of history has to go through them again, and we're currently stuck on religion with Jordan Peterson, as Cadell talks about in the introduction. But there's also a way where absolute knowing is already contained in history. It's not like a development where some people are at absolute knowing and others are not. It's a description of the movement of spirit that we've already participated in and have to realize. It's not really create. And maybe we're denying, or we have forgotten, or we've overlooked what has been realized, and that's causing pathologies. And that's kind of what I would say, is that there's a way in which what we have learned we have forgotten, which of course brings Meno and Plato to mind. And so we're not really talking about a developmental logic that allows some people to be more developmental than others. Everyone is always already constituted by the entire phenomenological journey. The question is what speculative opportunities open up once we are aware of the phenomenological journey. And that's why the phenomenology of spirit is simply, it kind of ends before going to the science of logic. Holgate emphasizes that phenomenology and philosophy are kind of different for Hegel, in that the phenomenology is indeed a phenomenology, whereas the science of logic is quote-unquote philosophy proper. So it really, in that sense, it also wouldn't make much sense to say the phenomenology of spirit is a theory of everything if all it does is ultimately point to the science of logic. And then we have to ask, is the science of logic a theory of everything? And I don't think so. I think it is certainly trying to provide a sublation of Aristotle's logic by which we can tarry with the now. But but we can't predict what will follow if we do that. And Hegel's not trying to do that. There's this way, he constantly is saying things like, all we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. He's constantly kind of suggesting the fallibility of thought. He's very interested in history. And there's this sense in Hegel where the efforts to predict the future or to kind of learn the secret code of history so that we don't repeat it is mistaken. Instead, there's this sense, well, I'm biased, but I would say Hegel wants us to prepare us for the future, not plan the future, via sublations of logic and our capacities. There are subjective capacities that Hegel is trying to improve so that we might be prepared for whatever we encounter that we cannot predict. And that's very different. Now, again, Cadell is not going to say that Hegel doesn't help us at all at some possible theory of everything, nor is Cadell saying that a theory of everything is necessarily bad. It just depends. What Cadell writes is, From here, on page 67, from here, let us make sure we understand the Hegelian preconditions for even asking about a grand unified theory. So there's a way in which Hegel is giving us the preconditions necessary for even thinking a TOE, a toe. And if we don't meet these preconditions, then the toe will be problematic. So to continue reading from the book, Hegel derives the order of the coming to be of knowing with dialectical logic. And then this is critical, although even dialectical logic is left behind once one reaches the level of absolute knowing. In any case, he takes as his dialectical double starting point that, first, truth only exists from the standpoint of conscious knowledge, and second, conscious knowledge is concerned with truth. Thus, logically, there is a dimension of truth that is for us, truth for the knower, and a dimension of truth that is in itself, knower for the truth. And both of these dimensions fall within and on the side of a process of conscious knowing which needs to be historically developed in and as the subject's life process. If this is not a given precondition, then whatever toe we create will be extremely problematic. Cadell will then in chapter 3 talk about formative moments, understanding to differentiation, and we will be thinking Hegel again. And he's going to draw attention to the movements of understanding to reason, intuition and concept, consciousness of the whole, conceptual self-differentiation. And these kind of notions, this quadruplicity, to understand this quadruplicity is to understand Hegel in the conceptual essence of his being for world history, and that's on page 73. And Cadell will go through explaining what these are getting at and why these are important. I like the section on intuition and concept. I find very, very interesting. That's going to be in conversation with Kant and Schelling. There's this interesting emphasis, this section here, on the now and the here, and how, which is, and the here and now is critical to Hegel, as we've kind of pointed at, but there's also a very interesting, how do we make here and now universal in their singularity? And this is always a very tricky move in Hegel, and I think philosophy in general. We're trying to make a universal singularity, which seems like an impossibility, but if we can't do it, there seems to be trouble. And we'll talk about that more with belonging again. But anyway, I like what he wrote here, page 80 to 81. The ground of life itself is the intuition of the here and now, which becomes universal only in the negation of its intuitive moments, and thus supersedes itself into perception. This is parenthetical: perception, understanding, and eventually self-consciousness in the I as the thinking thing, and sources of concept, and so on. When it comes to the life process itself, devoid as it is of self-consciousness as well as the thinking thing as source of concepts, we find that the unity of a living organism is nothing but a tearing with this fragmented and disparate intuitive immediacy, space-time, which opens up the conditions of the possibility and the sources of selection pressures, the selections of this here or this now over another. But the here and now, which essentially becomes the background that we call space and time, does not itself change, but is the intuitive manifold as such. So again, there is a certain universality to space and time, but that opens up to singularity, but it has to be, I like how, wedded to the manifold of given intuitions. So let me read this. Thus, for Hegel, the true source of Kant's supposedly a priori transcendental categories of the understanding become too wedded to the manifold of given intuitions, here and nows, or space and times as transcendental a priori for thinking, and does not really follow through with his profoundest and truest insight, that of the I as the faculty of concepts and of the concept. This has profound consequences for the relation between universality and singularity, in that Kant places reason on the level of a universality which can never escape the singularity of its intuitions, and thus can never really access reality, the unknowable noumenon thing in itself. So this is where Kant ends up. In this Kantian model, the concept is never really historically derived in its concrete universality, but is subsumed by the singular of intuition, and thus remains an abstract particular as opposed to a concrete universal, poor in self-knowing as opposed to rich in self-knowing. I think this captures very well the difference between Hegel and Kant. One does not want to make a straw man of Kant. Kant was obviously a genius. But the universal for Hegel is located in the historic process. It is in the unfolding of space and time, not space and time as a priori transcendental categories by which phenomenon are bound together. They are with and in phenomenon, and yes, they are universal, but in so much as they afford singularities. And this means we can only get at reason in history. But then, of course, what this would also mean is that the noumenon, if Kant's noumenon keeps us from things in itself, well, for Hegel, the thing in itself is history, and history is an unfolding. So the fact that we can't access all of it is simply to say it is what it is. The lack is for us in that it gives us an active role in the way that the unfolding occurs, that we are really participating in it. The fact that we cannot get to the thing itself means that we are part of the thing in of itself, and we can't reach it because we have to create it, we have to participate in it. We can't, let's put it this way, I can't read a novel I haven't written yet. I have to read it and I have to write it and then I can read it. So in a sense, when you're trying to get at the thing of itself outside of history, you're trying to read a novel you have not written yet. You have to write it. And there's always in the historic process a book, a novel yet to be written. So there's always that which cannot be accessed. But that is because we are in it. We are in the thing. We are in the process of the writing of the novel. And that doesn't mean it will never be written. That just means it's always being written. And that is kind of the difference of locating reason in history versus transcendent of history. Cadell will explore more concept in the whole. I love chapter 4, the phenomenological turn, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. This is fascinating on German idealism, and we basically skipped German idealism in our thinking. And we have to get back to it. I do like this line. As it regards Hegel's absolute, it is the positivization of the very limited self. So limited self is made positive. It is that of which means we are participating in and relating to. Limit is not meaning that we are kept from, it means we are part of. And the way that Hegel structures that is very, very well. And I think also Cadell will speak here on problems of thinking of emergentism outside of historic process, outside the subject, outside of the community, where emergence is kind of over the community. That could be problematic. It just depends on what we mean. And again, Hegel is adamant, as Cadell writes on 108, it makes no sense to think of fundamental physics. Hegel will explicitly use examples of atoms and the void, abstracted away from the spiritual community, which unfolds the whole abstract endeavor concretely. So it really doesn't make sense to talk about the laws of nature or physics or atoms or anything independent of the subjects of whom are learning about the atoms in the universe and how the historic moment enables them to so learn and how their subjectivity is calibrated to be able to so handle such learning. These things have to be taken together. It makes me think of Paul Feyerabend. It makes me think of Planier and personal knowledge. All of these thinkers who really want to stress. And again, I suppose we can think of Wolfgang Smith with vertical causation. Like, we really have to be very careful to discuss physics independent of the physicist. Does this mean there is no knowledge at all to be gained from the scientific method that tries to find constants? You know, what is a constant result we get regardless the person observing it, as Jonathan Rauch talks about in Kindly Inquisitors? No, not at all. That method is very important. But we must never forget that this is a special case, and also we might be getting at constants or patterns, but that's not the same as getting at the thing itself. Just because balls all fall when they drop does not mean we now can predict the future or create theories of everything by which we can know the future. Yes, we can know consistency, we can use constants, but we must never separate that knowledge and treat it over or against a life process. And this also is, I think, what Hume was doing with his critique of is and ought and constant in the laws of causality. He wanted our ideas of causality and oughtness to be based on suchness, immediate experience, not abstracted from those things. And if we make that mistake, I think we end up in a lot of trouble. Cadell's work on Hegel leads into Nietzsche, and I think we can see why, once we take seriously the spirit science that Hegel is bringing forth, and, you know, ultimately we could say that what Hegel is bringing, as Cadell writes on page 130, is there's kind of a new form of objectivity, the conceptual drive, or the drive of the concept. So the concept itself gets a certain drive, which of course this also is important because the concept requires the substance-subject relation. It can't be just from the object itself. The concept becomes central, the conceptual drive, the drive of the concept. And the problem is some forms of science that are not spirit science can ignore that. And this would have ramifications for politics. And this is where in chapter 6, he's going to be talking about philosophical speculation for political science. We're going to talk philosophy of right, which I am very partial to and think is really, really important. He'll go through rights, ethics, states, and how these play, what Hegel means by these categories. And also how what we've talked about in the phenomenology of understanding limits is also going to be tied to a political science of encountering limits, accepting the now. If the state, I always think it's useful to think of the state in the philosophy of right as the state of now. And if whatever exists now is that which we should assume exists for a reason, and that it enables political opportunity or social possibility that otherwise would be impossible. And I like this line on 140. The Hegelian key is to understand one's limits, to unlock one's potential, to understand one's own impotence, to unlock one's potency in the face of the absolute unlimited world spirit in of itself, culminating in the seemingly eternal threat of warring, or at the very least, conflictual states. So there's a tension between the individual seeing themselves as impotent and weak regarding a state, and yet also keeping in mind that, so the individual needs the state, but the state also is in tension and always almost going to war and all of these different things. And between the contradiction of the individual and the state, we need to think our new political thought, which is going to be tied to a science of spirit, which is ultimately in a way going to be getting better at getting is about getting better at being wrong. I really like this line, 142. The only way to get better at being wrong is to become a scientist of spirit. And again, can Hegel really be a theory of everything if it is so much contingent upon being wrong and getting good at being wrong? I think not. And Hegel is also showing how being wrong is a driver for the development of spirit and thought. And I think that is very, very powerful. Cadell will talk about evil consciousness in the philosophy of right. He'll mention McGowan, talk about Todd McGowan's work. And then we will end up in chapter 7, he's going to talk about the logic for the global brain and be reviewing some of the key ideas that came up in the conference. I just would suggest watching the conference, philosophyportal.org. This was extremely important. He's going to elaborate on meta-dialectics. He'll talk about a wisdom commons. So we're thinking McCarricker. Then Peter Limburg at the Stoa with the Wisdom Commons. I enjoy what was shared here. Art and the Threshold, going through Bruce Alderman's work. I think it is extremely important to be reviewing the different thinkers online like this. I think it's so important. He'll talk about Thomas Wynne on Hegel and Heidegger. He'll talk about the work I did on Leibniz and the shock of difference, the real relation. The technological apocalypse I enjoyed with Dr. Hammelrick. Peter Hughes, important work. Peter Rollins. The conference was really, really wonderful. And then we had he'll have a piece on chapter 8, systems and subjects, referring to, I had a conversation with Cadell, Layman Pascal, and Tim Adlin about Cadell's book, System and Subjects, which I think is an important book and ties directly into Hegel's Science of Logic. I think that science, systems and subjects and science of logic are very, very strongly connected. And then chapter 9 is going to get at the stakes of techno-social sublation. And I love this opening, thinking Lacan and C.S. Lewis together. That's really, really great. He'll talk about Owen's work with the Dark Renaissance, and what exactly is a total Renaissance even possible, because all of this is suggesting perhaps the need for some kind of Renaissance. But how exactly do we do that? How do we do that in a manner that does not get us destroyed? It's not going to be easy. But I do like and again, all of this is pointing toward new community, new organizations, new politics, new kind of subjectivities that can handle new group gatherings. And that's not going to be easy. And I like these kind of 5 ideas that Cadell writes out, speaking of Limburg's work. So first, we have to keep in mind that all communities are terrible. Second, we must constantly dialectically balance the tyranny of structurelessness and the constant threat of a cult state, as well as intimacy without friendships. 3, we must constantly stay in self-critique, self-relating negativity about our own capacity to distort social fields, as well as the powers of those closest to us, friends and enemies alike, to do the same. 4, we must constantly stay in touch with the truth of our drive, to be able to look ourselves in the mirror, live with ourselves, transparent to those closest and those who have made what we do what it is, and simultaneously in the process eliminate the need to sneak around, gaslight friends, or over-dominate conversations. And 5, we have to constantly construct while constantly disappearing at the same time. And that last one, I think, is important. So he's speaking of Limburg here and the implications of that. He will then, in chapter 11, talk about sacred processing, profane sublation. And I think he mentions Rivera here, which I enjoyed speaking about Javier Rivera. He's going to talk of the Church of Contradiction, which is something that Peter Rollins will talk about. And that leads straight into chapter 12, with Barry Taylor has also been in conversation with Cadell regarding these matters. And I think the Church of Contradiction is a wonderful topic to end the first section of the book on, which will lead into drive myths, spiritual Bildung. And I think that is going to be critical, the establishment of new drive myths. I am quite partial to thinking intrinsic motivation to the new address of belonging again. And I think where Cadell ends the first section speaking about the Church of Contradiction sets this up very nicely. And that will lead us to the next part of our discussion. For more by Cadell Last, please visit philosophyportal.org. Please visit Amazon and pick up Real Speculations today. Then Cadell's YouTube channel and Substack. And thank you so much for your time.